Thank you very much for joining, and thank you very much for watching. I'm Majid Beni, Associate Editor of The Brains, and I'm also an assistant professor at Middle East Technical University at Ankara. So the topic of this event, this roundtable, is theories of consciousness under the free energy principle and various philosophical interpretation of consciousness along the lines of realism and illusionism. And we have very significant hosts that contributed to this event significantly. I'm starting to briefly introduce the guests, even though the guests do not need my introduction, are quite well known. And then we will proceed by starting the actual conversation. So Professor Karl Friston, who is the Principal Research Fellow and Senior Director of Wellcome Trust Center of Neuroimaging, and a Professor of Institute of Neurology at University College London, is a renowned authority on brain imaging. And he's also the main person who develops the neurobiological framework of free energy principle for action and perception. And I think that he will be able to speak about this with much more fluency and grace than I am. The other guest is Professor Solms, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Cape Town, and he's known for his discovery of the brain mechanisms of dreaming and his use of psychoanalytic methods in contemporary neuroscience to grow two paradigms, draw meaningful connections between two paradigms, neuroscience and psychoanalysis. And with regard to the topic of this conversation, he connected free energy principle to Freudian ideas of effective mechanisms that grow consciousness. And it is very hard not to marvel at the theoretical and experimental richness of his work. Dr. Dolega is affiliated with the Center of Research in Cognition and Neuroscience of the University of Libre de Bruxelles, and he investigated the way in which computational models develop within the framework of predictive processing constrain the spate of possible mechanisms that are underlie perceptual experience. And he did significant work on illusionism, and he applied it to the framework of predictive processing and free energy principle. And eventually, there is Dr. Wanja Wiese, who is a researcher and a lecturer at Ruhr University of Bochum Institute of Philosophy. And in 2018, he published Experienced Allness with MIT Press. Yeah, I'm very proud of hosting this event, and I thank the guests on behalf of myself and the Brains for participating. Without further ado, I'm going to leave the floor to Karl and ask him to speak a bit about free energy principle and its relevance to consciousness, I think in around 5-6 minutes, if possible. Please, Karl.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, and nice to see old friends and new friends on the panel. I'm afraid I can't talk with grace and fluency because I've just woken up. I don't normally talk to people before about 12 o'clock. It's very early in the morning in the United Kingdom. But I'll do my best to situate the perspective that I would take on these issues. And that's largely a perspective of the physicist trying to understand the brain as a self-organizing system. And from that point of view, much rests upon the way that you individuate the brain and possibly body from the rest of the universe. And that individuation or separation does speak to some interesting issues about realism versus illusionism. And it speaks to them in a way which either you can regard as accommodating both perspectives or possibly dissolving the dialectic, depending upon how you want to frame it. So from the point of view of an internalist, or the notion that all we will ever know of the outside world that is beyond the boundary that separates us from the external world, should it exist. I think that's a perfectly viable and it is a view that is almost mandated by the premises of the free energy principle, in the sense that what the free energy principle says is that you can describe or interpret internal brain dynamics as, in some formal sense, representing the causes of sensations, bearing in mind that the brain only has access to those sensory impressions from the world, should it exist. And as such, it is inherently representational. And furthermore, it will never know what is on the outside if the outside actually exists. So all of the internal neuronal dynamics are effectively described as updating illusions, updating Bayesian beliefs, probabilistic representations of things that could have caused those sensations. You can articulate this in terms of statistics, in terms of hypotheses. You could even say that these are just fantasies, leading to the notion that the brain is a fantastic organ. So that would be one view. However, to if you like, license that view, the physics says that this process arises just in the context of a synchronization between the inside and the outside. So the whole point of the physics interpretation of this representation or inference process is a result of a synchronization, technically a free energy minimizing process, whereby the brain comes to evince a generalized synchrony between the inside and the outside, such that you now have a good representational model of the lived world. And that, of course, presupposes that that world actually exists in order for you to synchronize. So that would firmly place you in a realist camp, in the sense you can't have a generalized synchrony or a joint synchronization in the joint space of the world and the inner life, or the neuronal dynamics, unless there exists something on the outside to cause sensations. So the physicist, I'm afraid, is not going to be able to resolve if there is a debate between realism and skepticism or illusionism. That's what I would say. That's maybe even in 4 minutes, I'm not sure.
Well, splendid. I think that there are many interesting points in what you said, and I'm at least going to point out several of them during this conversation. I'm sure that others that are more well-versed in these ideas will also point out to several of these issues. But I thank you very much for the time being, and I'm going to move to Professor Solms, to Mark. I have to say that before reading your work, Mark, I was not aware that Freud also spoke of entropy, and this because I was very ignorant of everything that happens in psychoanalysis. But it was very amazing and fantastic the way that you were relating free energy principle to some of the basic Freudian ideas. I will appreciate it very much if you start by speaking a bit about the relation between Freudian ideas and free energy principle, and then develop that into your discussion of consciousness, effective mechanisms of consciousness.
Thanks very much. I'm glad to speak immediately after Karl, because I can start by saying that I agree with everything he just said, and then I'll build upon it. So I will try to be brief about the foundations, because Karl has just articulated them. Of course, I accept that we only have access to our model of the world, which we then test against our sensory states, which are not the world, they are our sensory states. But I would emphasize what I think Karl emphasized toward the end, which is that we have this model of reality for a reason, which is that we have to survive, we have to continue to exist as a system, or at least we try to continue to exist as a system, by testing our predictions about how we can meet our needs in that world. So that is a realist position. I don't think that our model of the world is an illusion. It's our best guess as to what the reality is that we have to navigate in order to meet our needs there. Now, if I can take Donald Hoffman as an example, a representative of illusionism, I think it's very telling that his whole account rests on the hypothesis that we are self-organizing systems which are seeking to survive in an environment, seeking not only as individuals, but as instances of a species. His whole view is grounded in natural selection. That's the reality that he bases his entire view on. So that's I think, as I say, a very important point for us to recognize. That's the kind of a base from which his whole account of what we perceive is not what's really there, but rather our sort of construction of what's there. And we sample only those things that matter to us, and different phenotypes will therefore sample different things, and they'll represent them in different ways. All of that is predicated on the idea that we are seeking to survive and reproduce in a reality, which we are modeling. Now, you ask about my commitments to Freud. The reason that I became interested in Freud, which I must tell you was not my starting point. My starting point was neuropsychology, but I was very frustrated by when I trained in the 1980s, by our failure to take account of, or to take seriously, or to put at the center of our field subjectivity, because what is a mind if not something subjective? The essence of subjectivity is what it feels like to be a mind. So I was interested in trying to learn more about feeling. And that's what drew me to Freud. So going back to what I said about us us being required to, obliged to model the world, because that's where we can meet our needs. It's the only place we can meet our needs. Those needs, what in the free energy principle or the active inference framework, we call our prior preference distribution. These are our phenotypic needs. Freud calls those drives. And we feel how well or badly we are doing in relation to meeting our needs, that is to say, satisfying drive pressures. That's what feeling is. It's valenced. It tells us how well or badly we're doing, and it has qualities because we have different categories of needs. We're complex systems which have multiple needs. We have to meet all of those needs in reality. It's not just a matter of some common denominator in minimizing our free energy. We have to minimize it across all these categories because you need to eat and sleep and drink and etc. So that's why it has different qualities. Now comes my main point. Those feelings, I don't think that we can call them illusions. I mean, how can you say that you have an illusion that you are sleepy, or that you have an illusion that you are sad? You just are sad if you're sad. You just are sleepy if you're sleepy. You just are in pain if you feel pain. The illusion might be that you're misrepresenting or misconstruing the context, the causes of that pain, but the pain is just itself. It is a feeling of pain, and it's real in the subjective experience of the self-organizing system. Then you feel your way into your perceptions, in order to understand the context and in order to palpate the success or failure of what you're doing in that context, in order to ameliorate negative feelings and promote positive feelings. In other words, in order to meet your needs there. So that for me is the bottom line. Consciousness in its foundational form is feeling. And given what I've said about feeling not being illusory, but rather the sort of guiding principle of the whole thing, precisely because it's premised on us being a self-organizing system that's seeking to survive as a product of natural selection. I think I would have to place myself on the realist side of the spectrum, without that meaning a naive realism. The reality is, of course, modeled. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Something that has been mentioned by both you and Karl, and most probably we will come back to that, was that when speaking of realism, you were basically speaking about realism, reality of our world models, which is in a way, I think, would be, would sound like some sort of reality about the external world rather than reality of consciousness states per se, which could be the same thing or could be related to either in a very significant way. It is philosopher in me speaking, who is also a pedant. But I think that I'm going to ask a few more questions about that, the reality of our world models and your realist stance about consciousness would be something that I'm going to come back to. But thank you very much, fantastic. I think that we can move to Krzysztof, who has done fantastic work on illusionism, a view that has been advocated also by philosophers such as Kit Frankish and Daniel Dennett. Chris, do you like to speak about your stance a bit and relevance to the present discussion?
Sure. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me, and it's really an honor to be among such distinguished speakers here. So let me start by saying that I don't disagree fundamentally with anything that has been said so far, which might impact, the supposed adversarial atmosphere or kind of the contest of ideas that you wanted to have here, Majid. I think one thing that appeared in what Mark and Karl have said is this distinction, first of all, between how we represent the world, or what Wilfrid Sellars has called the manifest image, how things appear to us, and how the world is, which Wilfrid Sellars called the scientific image. And in my work, a lot of my work has been motivated by the apparent need to build a bridge between, how things appear to us, how pre-theoretically, intuitively, as we go about our daily lives, and what science tells us about how different phenomena work. One common example here is color. We live with this intuitive grasp that colors are properties of objects, the properties of surfaces, and then science comes along and scientists come along and they tell us, well, it's not so simple, because it's not just about the proper light reflectance properties of surfaces, it's also about the source of light, the wavelengths of the radiation. It's also about the context in which you're viewing things. It's also about the structure of your ocular system and the structure of your visual processing system, right? So all these things, there's this complex nexus of interactions between external causes, as we would often call them, and internal processes that give rise to our perception of color. And what's really interesting about colors is even after you learn a lot, maybe not everything there is to know about color, as some philosophers have postulated in some thought experiments, but even after you learn a lot about the science of vision, you still live in the manifest image. Colors still appear as properties of surfaces, and somehow there's a tension, right, between what vision science tells us about color, what optics tell us about colors and how colors appear in our conscious experience. And this is the central tension that's in question with illusionism, because science tells us that everything there is to say about the perception of color can be explained using functional or dispositional properties. So in principle, we're not there yet, but in principle, we could have a complete description of all the possible interactions that happen between a subject and the world, and all the physical processing that happens inside of a subject in order to give rise to color experience. And that would be a complete scientific theory of how human color vision operates. On the other hand, philosophers have come along, philosophers like Thomas Nagel have come along and said, oh, but this functional description of the physical processing, that would leave something out of the picture. It would leave out the subjective quality of the experience. It's not, seeing blue is not just my ability to discriminate blue-colored objects or discriminate different shades of blue. It's also some kind of ineffable quality of seeing blueness that's fundamentally different from just the functional property of what it is to discriminate blue colors or blue objects that usually appear to us as blue, maybe I should say. And what illusionists want to say is they don't want to deny, they're not solipsists, so they don't want to deny there's an external world. We all agree that there's an external reality. What illusionists want to deny and what they claim is the problematic part of the philosophical picture of how consciousness is supposed to operate, of what the manifest image is furnished with, are these mysterious properties of subjective qualitative experience that supposedly cannot be reduced to complex organizations of functional elements that somehow interact together and bring about a certain perspective on the world. And this is the main problem that illusionism is targeting. So, for example, when Marx said that, you know, when I'm in pain, I'm obviously in pain. And what illusionists want to deny is not that when you say you're in pain, you're just behaving as if you're in pain, but there's actually nothing happening inside, or there's no pain experience happening. What illusionists would like to do is describe that process in purely functional terms or purely dispositional terms. And here I'm talking not only about behavioral dispositions, but of course about dispositional properties of different neural circuits involved in noiseception and other parts of the brain. And would like to say that, well, this is basically all there is to be in pain. There's no kind of mysterious extra essence that's imbued into functional processing in order for it to make it somehow, you know, feel especially conscious in some way. There might be necessary processing that's involved in certain sensations being conscious or being unconscious, and that's all fine. So we might need to have a theory about access consciousness, for example. But in principle, phenomenal consciousness is a kind of illusion. So it's just our perspective as organisms in the world that's where we don't have kind of complete picture of how things operate within us as well as outside of the world. And maybe one thing that I would like to maybe we can get back to, because we were talking a lot already about representing the world. I guess maybe one point where I disagree with Mark and Karl is that I'm not entirely sure how accurate our internal models of the world are. So my worry coming from considerations, you know, of how evolutionary development has progressed, my worry is that the models of the world that evolution has furnished us with, they are satisficing models rather than optimal models. There are models that are supposed to be good enough for the evolutionary pressures, for the selective pressures that we face. They're not models that are aimed at completely accurate or truthful picture of how the external reality is, right? The model of the world that evolution has given to humans is very different from the model of the world that evolution has given to rats, precisely because the pressures on different organisms have been very different through evolutionary development. So I guess this is what I would like to get back to while we're discussing, but I think that's it for now.
Splendid. Yeah, and I'm very happy that you want to come back to this discussion again, because I think that is something that a realist would say, and I'm not a realist, but I think that a realist could say that, all right, our world models may not be accurate at all. And at the same time, the phenomenal experiences that we have could be quite real and genuine, because we are going to have this kind of experiences. There is no way of setting a distinction between an experiential state that is not genuine. And this is the difference between realism about external world and world models and realism about conscious states, because in order to be realist about conscious states, you don't need to set a distinction between genuine experiential states and other sorts of experiential states, because there are no two kinds of experiential states. But I think that this is a nice opportunity to continue this discussion. And we will come back to that. Wanja.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I'm glad that Chris added some clarifications about what illusionism is, and I just want to repeat one of the aspects that Chris mentioned, because I think it's really important. So illusionists don't deny that consciousness exists. They don't deny that feelings exist. They only deny that we have a special epistemic access to our conscious states. So when we introspect, we may have the impression that we are intimately connected to our conscious experiences, that we know exactly what it's like to have feelings of pain or hunger or thirst. But illusionists point to the possibility or argue that we may misrepresent our internal states when we introspect. And so we have the impression that we have a direct, immediate access to our conscious states. But according to illusionists, this access is mediated by some internal mechanisms which may in some sense be biased or provide an inaccurate representation even of our internal states. And since illusionists don't deny the existence of consciousness and the existence of feelings, there's one, I think, very important question and problem that both realists and illusionists have to take a stance on and have to think about. And it's the problem of artificial consciousness. So Mark, I'm currently reading The Hidden Spring, and I think it's a wonderful book. I'm, I think, about halfway through, but when I started reading, I immediately skipped to chapter 12, in which you write about artificial consciousness. And so one of the, I think, central questions here is to what extent there could be consciousness in a computer simulation or in a disembodied artificial system. Do artificially conscious systems need something like a body to be conscious, or could consciousness exist in a disembodied system, in a computer simulation? Or in other words, so I mean, most people agree or believe that current large language models are not conscious. But what if they have slightly more sophisticated abilities, or if they have some of the abilities and properties that David Chalmers has considered in his recent talk and draft paper on large language models and consciousness. So what if large language models have something like unified agency or a unique personality and react in coherent ways over time to prompts that are given to them? What if they have a coherent world model with no internal or little contradictions? Or what if they have something like common sense? Or what if they can be hooked up to robots that interact with the physical environment? At what point could they be conscious? Or is there something about being a living organism that is important, and that would only be, do living organisms have some properties that are really hard to instantiate by artificial systems? And yeah, so the question is, could there be consciousness in a disembodied system in a computer simulation? And given that illusionists don't deny the existence of consciousness, it's also an important question for illusionists. And I would be interested in hearing what the others think about this. Mark, I was really surprised by what you write in your chapter on artificial consciousness, because you argue that for moral reasons, we should, and as you say, you have the intention of creating artificial consciousness in a controlled way to exploit. And maybe you can say more about that. And you also say that at first you would use computer simulations to create such a system, but then at some point you would probably need to implement this in a robot which can interact with the environment. And what I'd be interested in is hearing whether you think this must be so for practical reasons, because it's just, can be quite complex to build a detailed enough simulation of an environment in which a virtual entity can interact? Or do you think that real consciousness requires embodiment in a robot in an artificial body that can interact with the physical environment?
Thank you very much for your input, Wanja, which also opens many new cans of worms, because they're all interesting topics, embodiments, and also this hot topic of large linguistic models and their consciousness. But before moving to Karl, could I ask you briefly to unpack the to unpack this, to explain how it is related? What are the consequences for the discussion of realism and illusionism if this kind of large language models could have consciousness or couldn't? How would it affect the realist or illusionist stance on consciousness? Wanja, I'm asking you if possible.
Yeah, so I think this question is largely orthogonal to the debate between illusionism and realism, but it's a very important question. And I think the answers that you're giving, or the reasons that you're giving for the view, may differ relative to whether you are an illusionist or realist. But it's not that illusionism entails that there can be consciousness in a computer simulation, or that realism entails that there cannot be. So both views are compatible with different views on artificial consciousness, but it may be that the reasons given will be slightly different.
All right, very well. We have to see whether we have enough time to explore. I was not ready for that, to be able to scrutinize these reasons that illusionists or realists may provide for their stance on consciousness in large linguistic models. yeah, but I think that by all means, this is a very important issue that is in need of being handled delicately. So I thank you very much for adding this input to the discussion, giving it this momentum. I think that we can return to Karl, and it will be up to him to continue the discussion in any path that he sees adequate. I wanted to also ask him to elaborate a bit on the relation between our models of the world and then consciousness and self-consciousness, because most of the discussion has been directed at this point about the physicist point, about the reality of our models of the world. So Karl, please continue the discussion.
Right. Well, as Remy says, it's very useful to have illusionism unpacked and defined. I didn't know that, so you know, my position has changed since hearing Chris's description of it. So just to revisit the physicist's perspective on this, and then take up the challenge of where does consciousness get into the game from a sort of non-philosophical view. I think the way that the use the word satisficing, and that the constructs that may be entailed by our neuronal activity and our putative mind are divorced from a realist description of the kind you might get from a physicist or an experimentalist who's dissected the brain and understands all the biophysics that subtend sense making. I think that's absolutely right from the physics point of view, and indeed is mandated. So the whole point of the free energy principle is that you are trying to build good models of the world, that you will never know what is the world. The whole point is that there is only the best model, and you know, as statisticians say, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And the most useful one is that which has the greatest evidence or marginal likelihood. Literally, if you are taking a sort of an evolutionary perspective, the likelihood of finding this phenotype that just is a good model of her eco-niche or her lived world. So what does that mean mathematically to maximize the marginal likelihood or the evidence, the model evidence? It just means that those models provide an accurate account of sensations in a way that minimizes complexity. And that complexity minimization is absolutely crucial. So it's not trying to find the best, most accurate accounts of the kind that you might, I think, might associate with the physicist trying to understand color perception. Those are completely useless models. They overfit, they don't generalize, they don't survive for, you know, either for milliseconds in our head or millennia in cultural or scientific cultural evolution. So it is exactly those satisficing kind of models that have the right amount of coarse graining, the right that have the greatest evidence. So the free energy is also in machine learning known as an evidence lower bound. It is exactly the quantity that measures the right amount of satisficing. So by definition, I would imagine that if you commit to the free energy principle, you are committing to an illusionist stance, and it's the best kind of illusions, noting there are no alternatives. You know, you will never know you will never know, and you cannot know the real world, because if you did, you would be part of it, and you would not be individuated from that world. So there is no other option. So I just wanted to celebrate that from the point of view of the physicist, and also that's satisficing. You know, it comes across technically in many different guises. You know, if you sort of speak to people like Nick Chater and his friends, it's all about the principle of simplicity or simplification. If you speak to statisticians, it's all about sort of you know, minimizing complexity and degrees of freedom that you bring to try and explain or synchronize or engage with some data and possibly a world behind those data. So I think it's a really fundamentally important thing, and also has thermodynamic imperatives as a physicist, that to do it in a satisfying way with maximizing the marginal likelihood on the model evidence is to do it in a both informationally and thermodynamically efficient fashion. So illusionism is good from my point of view. I've learned that today. The question of well, yeah, there is another sort of key point here. I'm just wondering whether to move onto consciousness. Perhaps we should do that. So from the point of view, again, or my point of view at least, through the lens of a physicist, the consciousness would of the kind that I think we're talking about would be a special kind of sense making, and would certainly involve some kind of action, and that action could either be overt or it could be covert, in the sense that it requires operations on the internal world model or its representation in terms of internal dynamics. And I'm sure Mark will speak to this in a moment, but of course, if you're going to imbue your sense making with feelings, then one important kind of action is estimating the degree to which preferences are satisfied and the precision or the certainty with which that is happening. That's a sort of key kind of action. So I would be looking, if I had to look at a system and look at its anatomy and physiology and ask, would it have the capacity to be conscious? I'd be looking for evidence that it would be able to coordinate and act upon its own sense-making mechanisms. And implicit in that capacity, or the evidence for that kind of capacity, would be the notion that the world models that this system makes sense, understands and synchronizes with its world, include a model of the future, and that inherits from the very fact that to act means that you have to have a model of the consequences of your action, which means you have to have a model of the future. And that's a very special thing. Not everything has that. Thermostats don't have that. I would argue that viruses don't have that. But so I would argue that the Mark has that. So of all systems that self-organized, a few privileged systems may well have this capacity to act and thereby evince a model of the future. So if that's the case, what kind of action would be associated with consciousness, and usually it ends up being some kind of attention or some deployment of precision or estimation of uncertainty. And I say that because it is interesting that I don't want to distract. So Majid doesn't want to talk about large language models unless it relates to illusionism versus realism. But it is quite interesting that the big thing, the bright line between the architectures that underwrite large language models and all other machine learning is attention. It's the ability to selectively or to select things in the past that have a greater predictive validity in relation to the next word. So certainly there's a baby step in large language models towards the kind of architectures that I think would be necessary to support consciousness in the way that we're talking about it. Are they there? Do they need bodies? Strictly speaking, you can have action without necessarily having a physical body if you include attention in action. So, but you have to have the ability to select the data and the sensations and the exchanges with which you are synchronizing, or via which you are synchronizing with something out there. You can't have something that's disembodied in the sense of unconnected with the world. Otherwise, there can be no generalized synchronization. There can be no self-organization of the kind that we are that underwrites the modeling perspective and indeed the free energy principle. So you have to have some embodied situatedness. But does it have to be a physical body? I don't see where it has to be a physical body. I can imagine being a computer sitting in a world wide web, actively selecting which sort of messages and transaction protocols to attend to, and planning and thinking about the future. I think that would be one way of synchronizing with the rest of the world, where the rest of my world was the World Wide Web, for example. Those are some thoughts.
Thank you very much. It was not my intent to block the way of discussing Wanja's input. On the contrary, I was trying to buy time to be able to think about that. And one thing that, I understand that these systems are not embodied in the way that we are, but I was wondering whether we can really assume that the systems are disembodied and do not engage in some sort of interaction with the world and that sort of stuff. I actually wanted you to address this issue in the next round, and we may still return to that in the next round. But something that you also mentioned in this round, Karl, was that the models that evolved are generated in this minimizing free energy are illusions, but there is no alternative to that. And then again, the philosopher in me says that if there are no alternatives, if there is no criterion against which to check the reality of these models, could we really assume that they are illusions? If we can't, if there is no alternative, in what sense they could be illusion as opposed to reality, if there is nothing to compare them with? And I think that I'm going to also ask the question of Chris. But thank you very much, Karl. And I think that I would ask Mark to elaborate a bit on what he said about the relation between affective mechanisms and consciousness. I assume that a really hardcore advocate of the hard problem would say that, all right, perhaps the mechanisms of affection too are only solving the easy problem. And I understand that there are good experimental reasons and theoretical reasons for assuming that emotions are intrinsically conscious. And I think that Mark has taught about that a lot. I think that it would be wonderful if he could also address that, as well as what Wanja said about large linguistic models and the discussion of moral aspects and conscious state that you stated in your new book, Mark.
Sorry, I got slightly lost there. I thought initially you were asking Chris a question, and then it seemed you were asking me a question.
Sorry, I was not very clear. I asked a question of Karl, and then I said that I'm going to ask also Chris that later. But
okay.
I didn't want to, sorry, it was my fault.
So no, I'll gladly address your question, and in the process also pick up on some of the points that Chris and Wanja made. I think that a good place to start is with the hard problem, and with this distinction between the phenomenal experience and the mechanistic account of that experience, introduced not for the first time, but by Tom Nagel, and then picked up by David Chalmers and others. I think that it's unfortunate that we started in our search for the neural correlates of consciousness, and therefore for a mechanistic understanding of it, that we started with perception and visual perception in particular. I don't think that visual perception is an intrinsically conscious process. When I say I don't think that, I mean, I doubt anybody could disagree. Visual perception goes on all the time without consciousness. So why start there? the same does not apply to affect, to feeling. You can't have a feeling without feeling it. So feelings are intrinsically conscious phenomena. And so I think we should start there if we want to understand the basic mechanism of consciousness. When I say that, I should just say in passing that it's not just a semantic point when I say feelings have to be felt and visual perceptions do not, and therefore we started in the wrong place. It is also a point grounded in evidence in the sense that the brain mechanisms, the cortical mechanisms for visual perception, they only render visual perception conscious to the extent that they are activated by core brainstem structures, which generate the fundamental form of consciousness, which is then applied to perceptual mechanisms. And those core brainstem, and I'm using the word very loosely here, I mean, I'm including all the arousal modulatory systems, including basal forebrain nuclei and so on. It's not just the reticular activating system. But these are the fundamental generators of consciousness. And for all the reasons that I spelled out in my book, it turns out that the kind of consciousness that those deep brain structures generate is affective. In other words, the basic fundamental form of consciousness, which is prerequisite for perceptual consciousness, is affective consciousness. In other words, it is feeling. So I'm saying we should start there. If Mary, the visual neuroscientist of Jackson's thought experiment, had been an affective neuroscientist, and she gave a mechanistic account of feeling, how does feeling come about? She would have to include that it feels like something. It would be intrinsic to her understanding of what feeling is. As I said earlier, feeling just is how well or badly we're doing in terms of remaining within our viable bounds. In other words, how well or badly we're doing in terms of satisfying our prior preferences. The mechanism for that, building on what Karl said earlier, has everything to do with precision optimization. How confident am I in my current policy as to how to satisfy this need? So how well or badly I'm doing, in other words, my feeling in relation to my deviation from my viable bounds is applied to the context within which that feeling is arising. And it's the palpating of the precision in the errors relative to the predictions or the policies that determines whether I continue along the same course or whether I change my mind. This is the mechanistic basis of voluntary action, which is how we transcend reflex, how we transcend obligatory stereotyped ways of meeting our needs, is to be able to feel our way through how well or badly we're doing. In other words, to modulate the precision in our predictions over the in relation to the error signals about the sensory states that we expected to flow from it. So that mechanistic explanation, I think absolutely fundamentally, we have to start with the fact that the system is trying to survive. In other words, the system gives a damn. And this starts to speak to the question about large language models. It has to be a system that is trying to maintain its own existence. Then it has to be a system that has multiple needs, which is what requires there to be categorical variables. The needs have to be qualitatively distinguished from each other. So you have an intrinsic valence. It just is bad for your free energy to increase. In other words, for your predictions to be giving rise to error all the time. And it just is good for that not to happen. So that's valence. It's an intrinsic part of the mechanism. And then that valence has to be categorized across these different necessarily qualitatively distinguished variables. And then it has to be experienced registered by the system. That's also intrinsic. It must be subjective. It's about the system. It's as Nagel said, it's by the organism for the organism. This is what the experience is what it is. So I think that mechanistic explanation of what a feeling is, and I'm not sure I've put it very clearly, but in the interest of time, I won't summarize it and repeat myself. I think that mechanistic explanation of what a feeling is from the point of view of the system just is a feeling. It just is the conscious state of feeling. And I remind you again, that is the fundamental form of consciousness, which is then applied to our palpating of our sensory states in relation to our active states. In other words, our actively authored sensory states are palpated by feeling, and that is what perceptual consciousness is. Now, I don't want to speak for too long, but I just want to address Wanja's question. Now, if we're going to claim to, as I am claiming to, have a rough and ready, more or less accurate understanding of the mechanism whereby feeling arises, then as Richard Feynman said, if I can't create it, I don't understand it. So that's the test. If you believe you have a mechanistic causal account of how feelings arise, then you should be able to engineer a system that feels. And that's what we're doing, and we're making good progress. Karl, since we reported back to you beginning of last year, we've made quite a bit more progress. And so yes, I don't believe that artificial consciousness is an impossibility. I think it's an eminently realistic probability, and I think in the very near future we are going to. In fact, I'm not even sure if we aren't there yet. We may already have we might not fully realize what we've done, but certainly I think we are going to do that. The question as to whether it has to be embodied or not, I don't see how anything can exist without it being embodied in the physicalist sense. I don't mean physiological sense. I mean, there cannot be a system which is not a thing. But in other words, it's a system which is self-organizing and which is trying to maintain its existence and has the capacity to change its mind on the fly. And all of those things, that means it's embodied. It has to be embodied. But when I said in the chapter at the end of my book that you referred to, and I'm coming now to the end of my monologue, that once after we have engineered reasonably successfully a simulation. If that's the word for it, an instantiation in a virtual reality is probably a better way of putting it. Then we want to embody it in a robot. There are two reasons why I want to do that. The one is because it's an empirical question. I'm interested to see how does, when the thing has to actually ambulate in a three-dimensional environment, it has some of the problems that we embodied creatures, it's the way in which our consciousness evolved. I imagine has a great deal to do with the fact that we are embodied creatures that have to ambulate in order to satisfy our needs in a three-dimensional world. So that's an empirical question, just to see what new dynamics arise, what new problems arise that we have to engineer our way out of. But frankly, the other reason is the problem of other minds and persuading my colleagues that we have engineered something which has feelings. I think that we're up against enough of a hurdle to begin with, but to tell them this system which is operating in a virtual environment is conscious is a hell of a lot harder to persuade them of than a robot tottering about in the three-dimensional world. So it's really just a matter of trying to reduce prejudice in terms of trying to persuade our colleagues that what we have engineered is indeed a system that feels what it is like to be that system. So I've skipped out a few things, but those are the main points that I wanted to make. Actually, sorry, one footnote about the accuracy and complexity that Karl raised in relation to Chris's point about how accurate are our models of the world. I agree very much with that, but I want to add that the reason that we feel is precisely because our models cannot be, not only for reasons of overfitting, over complexity, but also because we are, after all, necessarily sequestered from the world. We cannot know the world. Their models always will be imperfect. But consciousness, which is, I say again, intrinsically feeling, only comes about because we need to modulate our uncertainty about our models in relation to the sensory evidence that keeps arising. So the very existence of consciousness, on my view, flows from the imperfection of our models, the necessary imperfection of them. Thanks a lot.
I thank you, Mark. Yeah, in many ways, this discussion there are many new themes in this discussion of large linguistic models, whether they are capable of being conscious, and in light of what you said, Mark, whether they are capable of having emotions. In a way, these topics have been there for a very long time. I'm thinking of Alan Turing's 1950 paper, in which he gives the affirmative answer to both questions. They are capable of consciousness, and they are also capable of having emotions. And I appreciate the point very much that if we can, that if we can engineer that, if we can engineer these mechanisms, we can understand them, and we can have an insight into whether they are capable of having consciousness and emotions. But I think that in order to be able to give a very good answer to the question of whether these models are capable of having consciousness and also emotions, perhaps engineering them is not enough. When engineering, we have to be also have to be able to show that consciousness is intrinsic to this mechanism, and this is something that can be contributed not by engineering alone, but also by the theoretical assumptions and discussions that we have about the close connection between affections and consciousnness, and the fact that consciousness is intrinsic to affection. I think that later on, I'm going to continue this discussion a bit and ask whether is it reasonable to ask for some insights about the engineering approaches to making consciousness intrinsic to mechanisms of affection. I'm not even sure that it makes sense, but I think this is something that we may be able to discuss a bit more later. Chris.
Should I respond to your previous question that you asked to Mark as well and build up on Mark?
Yeah, I think that I think that the point that I made caused more confusion than elucidation. So please continue in any way that you like.
All right. So I mean, because also the discussion is getting more and more rich, and we have more and more things on the table. So maybe I'll try to clarify some things that have been said already, and then I'll try to add something new. So Mark started with the hard problem of consciousness and said that we should actually start with that problem first. And it's important to remember that the hard problem of consciousness as it has been posed is a metaphysical problem. So it's a problem about what kind of entities or properties there are in the world. And this is different from what has been called in the literature the explanatory gap, which is an epistemic problem about bridging our manifest image and our scientific images, right? And usually it's the case that the epistemic problem of there being an explanatory gap between how we experience the world and how science describes the world, that's what motivates postulating the metaphysical problem that there might be, two different kinds of substances or different kinds of properties, things like that. And what at least I and some illusionists I know do, we try to say that we shouldn't jump to assuming that the hard problem is correct, just from the fact that we don't know how to bridge the explanatory gap. So we shouldn't postulate, mysterious intrinsic properties or new kind of entities into the world before we try to figure out whether there's a way of closing the explanatory gap, or at least making the appearance of the explanatory gap intelligible to us without postulating some kind of metaphysical divides in nature. So that's one thing I wanted to point out. And so my perspective is that there is a problem that we have to answer to, but that problem is, first of all, epistemic rather than metaphysical. Coming closer to what Mark said about affect, it's important also to keep in mind the distinction between levels of consciousness, or what has been called as levels of consciousness, or which often boil down to levels of arousal, and the content of consciousness. And I was really impressed by Mark's book because I started reading it with a very skeptical lens. And as I kept going on, I found myself more and more convinced by the arguments and the case studies presented. And so I find the perspective that, even though we have in the literature the distinction between levels of consciousness and the contents of consciousness, so kind of consciousness as a gradation of states that are more or less conscious, and then distinction between the contents of these more or less conscious states at each level of consciousness. I think that it's really useful to think about these two things together. And I think that Mark's perspective is very useful in the way that there's definitely a plausible argument to be made that things or organisms were conscious first, and contents or the richness of contents came in later. So it seems to me that the reversal of the well-known or accepted view that Mark defense, which is that consciousness shouldn't be equated with the activity in the cortex, but it actually stems from the subcortical systems. I find that very plausible and very interesting from an evolutionary perspective, and I think that it seems to me clear that in order to have consciousness populated with different contents, with different experiences, there needs to be first kind of a mechanism or a platform for these contents to become conscious, or the sensations to somehow appear. And I find that very interesting, which brings us to what Karl said. So now, together with what Mark said, we seem to have three components of consciousness. So one component is the ability to act on one's own sense-making mechanisms. So I really like that. And I think this is a widely accepted view in neuroscience these days. That's often associated with cortical theories of consciousness, such as global workspace theory or attentional schema theory, and this idea that consciousness is actually for a sophisticated control system for self-regulating, not only as an organism in the world, but also for regulating one's internal states. And I'm completely on board with that. Second thing that Karl said was that we also need a kind of a deep model, which is able to predict things into the future. So we need to be able to control things not only as they appear, but also control them proactively, prospectively. And I think that's also very true. And it would be actually interesting to find out maybe whether, as we go through the phylogenetic tree and we have more and more complex organisms, whether this is the main difference kind of between different types of conscious organisms, this ability for prospection and modeling farther and farther into the future, kind of planning on longer and longer timescales, something that predictive coding and the free energy principle are able to accommodate well. And so that's what Karl said about consciousness. And then now the third element that Mark mentioned was some need for homeostatic regulation. So actually, the reason why an organism should be able to act on its own sense-making mechanisms and also do it prospectively into the future is because it needs to satisfy some needs which are critical for its survival. And this, of course, would have to come first, actually, if we're speaking of on a developmental timeline, in order for these later inventions to come about as more and more efficient ways of fulfilling these needs. And I think that's very, very interesting. I must say that I'm very sympathetic to the view that these needs are affective states, that basically I think it's 7 basic emotions that are mentioned in the book, that these are the basic needs that we need to regulate, and that they will be common at least across all mammals. And I find it very plausible to think that these needs, because they're connected to valence, they have evaluative components. I think that it's very plausible to think of them as necessarily conscious. It should be noted, however, that this is not the mainstream view in the literature on affect. So at least if I understand correctly, for example, Berridge, who introduced the important distinction between liking and wanting, and wanting being something that's associated with the activations of the dopaminergic system, whereas liking being linked to endogenous opioidal reward systems. If I understand correctly, Berridge has postulated that there can be unconscious wanting and conscious wanting, and unconscious liking and conscious liking. I would like to actually hear maybe more from Mark about what he thinks about that literature, because I think that the only reason for postulating unconscious liking is due to methodological constraints and not due to some kind of strong theoretical reason. So I would think that whenever you have a pleasant experience, that experience needs to be conscious. So I'm there with Mark. I'm a little bit still struggling with the idea that we would have to accept, that the seat of consciousness is actually located in the brainstem. But I'm open to being convinced. And just to bringing it back to large language models, what I would like to say, or in general artificial systems, is that one interesting thing about this imperative to satisfy needs is that we have to ask what kind of needs would be this basic platform for giving rise to consciousness, because nearly all machine learning systems are satisfying some kind of imperative, right? What they do is they satisfy the need to minimize some loss function, generally speaking. And it's an open question, especially in the context of the free energy principle and free energy minimization, whether all it takes for a system to have these, crucially necessary for conscious needs, whether all it takes is to have a need to minimize some loss function, because the free energy principle basically tells us this, right? The free energy principle basically tells us that, oh, well, all living things are minimizing a certain function. And I think it's an open discussion to whether that's all it takes. I saw that Mark is shaking his head. I'm also thinking that that's not enough, that there needs to be something more. But it's always an interesting question to pose. What is this something more, right? How should we unpack this in order to make sense of it? All right, I'll stop now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. Yeah, about the point that Mark raised, about converting the course of explanation starting from mechanism and then building up to phenomenon consciousness. I was also waiting for you to appreciate this. It has some sort of illusionist leaning into it. In a way, it made me to think of Dennett's Darwin dangerous idea, which seems to be very significant paper in illusionism literature. Yeah. And about the other points that you raised, and I think that it will be also speaking directly to what Wanja said earlier. Yeah, these large linguistic models are in a way certainly physical. I think that this is something that we knew since 1940s, Newell and Simon physical symbol system hypothesis. In order to have some sort of computation, you need to have some sort of physical substrate. But the way that Mark speaks about drives and needs, it seems to have some sort of human feeling to it, intuitively at least. It is a bit hard to be able to speculate in what way this kind of artificial systems could have also needs and drives. But then again, intuition is not something that illusionists cares too much for. So, Wanja, please continue the discussion. I would be very happy if also you add a few words about embodiment, disembodiment, and the relation with consciousness in the context of these computational models, large language models.
Yes, thank you. That's exactly the point I wanted to address. Let me start by clarifying what I had in mind when I said disembodied artificial system. So, of course, every system has to be realized by some physical system, and even a virtual avatar, virtual agent in a virtual reality has to be instantiated on some hardware. So in this sense, all systems are embodied and there are no disembodied systems. So what I had in mind was that this distinction between systems like a virtual agent in a purely virtual environment that can only interact with the virtual environment, and a system that has as it were, an interface with the non-virtual environment and can interact. And then Karl raised an interesting possibility, namely that there could be systems that are distributed on the internet, or maybe not distributed, but have access to the internet and can select information and in this way act on the physical environment, but in a way that is quite different from the way in which we interact with our physical environments. And in fact, I think recent models like these auto GPT models, which have a greater autonomy and can do various tasks on their own and connect to write emails and connect to different servers and so on. I think they already go in this direction. They have a way of interacting with the physical world, although their body is, if we can call it a body, is quite different from our body. And what I'm wondering now is, to what extent having intrinsic values and needs, to what extent does this require having this interface with the non-virtual environment? I mean, you can, I'm really not sure about this. So you can simulate an agent that maybe has a body like ours and has needs that are similar to our needs, and that acts in a virtual environment in which there are opportunities to satisfy the various needs in similar ways in which we do it. So in a sense, this system, this virtual system, has needs and can satisfy them, and in a way it may be have the same functional organization we have, and be a perfect simulation of our consciousness. And then the question is, well, is it also real consciousness, and does it have real needs? Does this already count as real? Are these intrinsic needs and values, or does this require some interface with the non-virtual environment? because the hardware on which the simulation is running does not have these needs. It does not, the computer does not satisfy its needs by simulating a virtual agent. And my intuition is that there is a difference, but so Majid already mentioned that in this context, we shouldn't rely on intuition. So I'm really wondering whether it's possible to make the case, give an argument for one of these sides. So is there, in what sense are there intrinsic values within the computer simulations, or is there a reason for regarding an interface with a non-virtual environment as important? And what I'm currently thinking about is whether you need some interface with the physical environment to understand whether, so I'm wondering whether you have to make this assumption that this interface is required in order to make sense of the moral relevance of conscious experience. So conscious experiences have moral importance, conscious systems have a moral status, and we think about conscious systems in different ways than about non-conscious systems. We have moral obligations towards them. And if we assume that, if we think that a virtual agent in a computer simulation can be just as conscious as we are, we would also have moral obligations towards such virtual entities. And I mean, it depends on whether you believe that virtual realities are equally real as non-virtual realities. And I tend towards the position that they are not. But of course, there are people like David Chalmers who argue that now virtual realities are just as real. They are digital realities, but that doesn't mean that they are less real. So I think this is a very central point. And what it comes down to, I think, is a question: do such systems need an interface with a non-virtual environment in order to have something like real needs and real conscious experience?
Thank you very much, Wanja. And also, I have to say that I didn't foresee that this discussion will take this interesting turn. And the time that I calculated for the discussion is officially ended. I do not want you to stay here and continue this discussion if you don't want to. But if you like, please, I think that at least we can continue with one more round of discussions, if you like to do so. So, Karl.
Yes, so just picking up on Vanya's question. I mean, again, from my perspective as a physicist, really, you know, this notion that there is a distinction between a virtual world and non-virtual world, you know, is a bit, it's I think something of a distraction. So I'd agree with David Chalmers, you know, especially if you're thinking about building worldwide webs, as many people are at the moment, the next version of the World Wide Web in this age of information, where you actually have to build physical sort of protocols and wires and optics and think about how people organize their lives and how things live on the web and organize their lives as well. This becomes very, very real, but it's all virtual. I think, you know, I think the distinction we're talking about here is whether we're talking about things that are animate, you know, whether the action is actually a movement in some metric space that means that I am moving and therefore I am animate. But of course, that animacy and that metric space and that Euclidean movement and that physiology and that homeostasis, these are all illusions in the sense that they're all models. So I don't think there's any mathematical distinction between a Markov blanket, which is, the mathematical description of the interface that you're talking about, that licenses an interpretation of what goes on inside the Markov blanket in terms of sense making and possibly planning. If there's an interface, then there is a way of separating what's behind that interface and the rest of the world, and therefore in simply identifying that interface, you now have a way of describing what's going on the inside in terms of Bayesian mechanics, and that certainly opens the opportunity for there to be potentially conscious processing of the kind that you've been talking about. But I think you have to identify what is a certain kind of processing that would be conscious, and if it was, could you ever demonstrate that it was this kind of processing? I just wanted to make the observation that the answer to that question is no. You will never know as an observer of another system or artifact or particle or person. You can, by definition, never know what's going on the inside. That's the whole point of the Markov blanket. So you can have as many teleological or mechanistic or philosophical interpretations or descriptions of what's going on underneath the Markov blanket or behind the interface. But the very definition of the interface means you will never know. You can only ever infer it. So I think that speaks to Mark's point before, that if you want to create artificial consciousness, you will never be able to prove it's conscious because it's only conscious from its perspective. So unless you breach the Markov blanket and therefore destroy the system, then you'll never know. But you can get them to behave so much like you that it's very difficult to deny that they must be conscious if they're like you, because you think you're conscious, because you do have access to what's going on inside your Markov blanket. So that means you've got to build artificial intelligences that look very much like me. That's the only ones that are ever going to work. This is basically the theory of mind explanation. So I thought it would be worth putting that into the, mathematically you can't ever know if something is conscious. Otherwise it wouldn't exist. And then, just to pick up so what is the essence of conscious processing on the inside or the essence of processing on the inside that would render it a candidate for consciousness of the kind that we're talking about. And I think that's been said in many different ways by everybody. Mark was talking about sort of applying, palpating, satisficing. People have been talking about. Notice all these words are verbs. So I haven't heard one definition of conscious processing that hasn't been introduced or predicated on a verb. So this is all about doing. It's not about sense making, it's all about planning and acting and doing. Palpating is an active thing, attending is an active thing. So whatever's going on in terms of sense making on the inside, which is unknowable, it has to be the kind of sense making that results in an action on the interface. Now there can be internal interfaces, and that would be the felt uncertainty that Mark was talking about as executively mediated by brainstem structures or subcortical structures or the pulvina. Irrespective of that, there has to be some actions. There has to be action in the mix, and therefore the sense making has to be in the service of emitting actions from the interface. So unless you have that, then I don't see that you're going to be able to say that, plausibly say that this thing could be conscious on the inside. And I repeat that, from my point of view, that's really important, because to act sensibly and from the point of view, just to use Chris's word, to close that epistemic gap between the current illusion and testing other illusions that may be more plausible, you need to have actions that have this epistemic aspect as well as the preference satisfying or satisficing aspects to it. I think that's at the heart of the mechanics that we're talking about that underwrites consciousness. It's all, what are the imperatives for action, not just sense making and minimizing prediction error, but the imperatives for action. And then that becomes, I think, an interesting game, because you have to start to think about sort of the information seeking and the goal seeking aspects, because before you can satisfy your needs, you need to resolve your uncertainty about the context in which you are going to resolve your needs. So I think I think that's an important aspect, that curiosity is going to be a companion of true consciousness. You can't have true consciousness without action. You can't have action without planning. You can't have planning without curiosity. That's what I would say.
Wonderful. With regard to the point that you raised, Karl, that I never will be able to know that an artificial system is conscious from its own perspective. I think that I can't know that about other people either, that they are conscious from their own perspective. So, and I think that this is one advantage of starting to take this bottom-up level, starting from mechanisms and engineering instead of taking the first person point of view first, and try to explain from mechanistic level engineering and building up to consciousness. But then again, as you appreciated early in this discussion, it also indicates that the difference between illusionism and realism is less than people used to think, I think. Thank you very much, Karl. Mark.
Yes, thank you. So I'll be very brief because we are over time. Just firstly to say, once again, everything that Karl just said, I agree with. So take that as given in what I'm going to say next. I want to address, I want to start my closing statement by addressing this question of the system's need. Is it just any old loss function? No, it's not just any old loss function. We're talking in relation to the free energy principle, we're talking about a quantity that has existential consequences for the system. In other words, if I, the system, do not minimize my free energy, I will cease to exist. So we're speaking of existential needs. That in turn speaks to Wanja's question about embodiment. And I take, as I said, I agree with everything that Karl said on that point. The reality of the system, its physical reality in the sense of statistical mechanics, statistical physics, that this is the reality of the system. It's a system that exists physically in the sense of physics. It is a self-organizing complex dynamical system that is therefore seeking to continue to exist. Its embodiment is its mark of blanket, its blanketed existence. It's trying to maintain the integrity of its blanket, in other words, the integrity of its systemness. And that's why it gives a damn. That's the existential need is what makes it necessarily subjective, which is, again, speaking to my point about what sort of mechanism can we infer underlies feeling the fundamental form of consciousness. I'm not going to enumerate again what its properties must be, but certainly it includes the fact that it is intrinsically subjective. I see, because I'm the host, I must admit, Chris, I've just done that. In what Karl was saying about the system is necessarily active, it's about I am acting. I agree with him, but I want to also, on the basis of what I've just said, underscore the I in the I am acting. I am acting in order to continue to be an I. That's why I must act, and I must modulate. I must palpate. I must attend to the success or failure of my actions. While speaking about needs, I just want to point out in relation to what Chris said about the 7 basic emotions that I mentioned in my book. Those are emotional needs. And incidentally, one of them is the need that that Karl just referred to, in other words, curiosity, which is the seeking need, which relates to the point about Kent Berridge and liking and wanting. But the emotional needs are not the totality of the needs of us mammals or other vertebrates or other organisms or other living things for that matter, but they are bodily needs which precede these emotional needs. Those 7 do not include hunger, thirst, thermoregulation, etc., etc. There's a multiplicity of bodily needs in addition to those emotional needs. I emphasize the emotional needs because it's a hell of a lot harder to predict other agents. The emotional needs usually pertain to needs in relation to other things which also have needs, and it's the unpredictability, the uncertainty becomes much greater there, which is probably the basis of the whole of psychopathology. Now, speaking of Berridge, I just want to say there that the distinction between conscious and unconscious wanting, unconscious, I don't see how you can have unconscious liking. As you say, you can't have a pleasure without it being pleasurable. But I know what he's talking about, and without going into all the complexities of that question, I will just say this: that from my point of view, the crucial thing is whether the precision in the policy is fixed or variable. Is the crucial issue. If you're executing a policy with a monotonous precision, you're not. It's not a matter of expected precision, which you then have to palpate depending on whether or not things are turning out as expected. That underwrites the distinction between what I'm calling feeling and what Berridge is calling unconscious wanting and whatnot. Of course, we can execute goal-directed, motivated, and in that very broad sense, affective policies without having to feel how well we're doing. But it's the ones that we feel that I think are called feelings. And that's why I focus on that word. There's also the question of prioritization, and that interdigitates it with the issue I've just mentioned. The need that is prioritized is the one that we have to feel how well we're doing in relation to it. It's the one that is most uncertain. The other ones then, like while you're fleeing danger, you wet your pants because you're not concerned about that need at that point in time. It's deprioritized. One closing remark about Chalmers's Reality Plus that has come up a few times in our discussion. I like Karl, remember I said I agree with everything Karl said. I'm very sympathetic to the view that Chalmers articulates there. But my closing remark is that I was disappointed or surprised by how little he speaks about feeling and the need of the system in these virtual environments to survive. And when he speaks about he speaks about the different types of virtual realities, the ones that we are, I forget the term for it, but we are playing this game and then we come back, we still are actually embodied creatures. He doesn't speak about if you don't eat outside of that virtual reality that you're playing in, you're a goner. And the same applies to virtual agents. Ultimately, it all comes down to their own existential needs. If they don't meet those, it's game over. Thanks very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Wanja has a question. Mark, do you want to also briefly address that, or we don't need to bring it right now? It's up to Mark.
Sorry, what is the question?
In the chat box.
Oh, I'll have a look.
All right, very well. Thank you very much. So, meanwhile, perhaps Chris says what he says, and then we can come back to Mark before ending. Go on, Chris.
Thank you, and sorry for disappearing briefly. It turns out that someone disconnected the Ethernet cable and I was just on Wi-Fi, which is very unreliable. Yes, so Yeah, so maybe just to mention something that was in the book, because I made when I was talking about in Mark's book, when I was talking about the seven emotions, I kind of jumped over the fact that Mark mentions that feelings are felt needs, which are needs outside of bounds, right? So I think the really enlightening claim in the book is that you only become aware of your physical or emotional needs once your system is kind of out of bounds, which is nicely congruent with the claims of the free energy principle and the fact that systems are supposed to stay within a certain range of states, and whenever they are outside of that range, they need to act in order to bring themselves back into that range of states prescribed by their phenotype. So I think that's really interesting. But what's really interesting about Mark's observation is that, well, basically, it's only if your needs are outside of the expected bounds do you become aware of them, which is a very interesting observation, and I think that's something I will have to think about more in the future. But it's really interesting. Going back to Wanja's question about simulations and consciousnesses simulations, I think that it's a really interesting question, especially the way Wanja phrased it. I have a suspicion that there might be a publication coming, or maybe already out, that poses this question because it was so well formed. So he has definitely thought about it a lot. But I would, from an illusionist perspective, I would say that we do actually have some obligations to simulated entities. So if we build systems that have the same informational economy as we do, except they're simulated on a different physical substrate, I would say that we would have moral obligations towards them. And perhaps my perspective on that would be the opposite of Chalmers's perspective. So it's not because virtual realities are as real as our external reality is. It's rather because our internal reality are as fictional as the fictional as the virtual realities are fictional. So I think that one of the things that I'm struggling with still in the illusionist picture of the world is the problem of self-knowledge, and illusionism. And illusionism brings with itself a kind of a heavy epistemic baggage about how do we know ourselves, because what illusionism basically says is that we don't know our own minds as well as we think we do, and I think that's a serious issue for the illusionist view. On the other hand, going back to the simulation question, I would say that just as our internal lives are, in a sense, an adaptive fiction, I think that if we simulated a sentient being in a simulated reality, their internal lives would also be a kind of adaptive fiction within that simulated reality. So we would have to give them a similar status to ourselves. And maybe just to end, because a lot of people these days level the accusation against illusionists that illusionists deny the moral dimension to consciousness, and I think that's totally not true. So illusionism does not deny that there's suffering in the world, and that each one of us can feel pain, both physical and emotional. The disagreement is about how we should exactly define these phenomena, and about the nature of their subjective element, let's call it, to avoid the word quality, not about the fact that they exist. So we do not deny that other animals suffer just the same way we suffer. And in fact, I think that because we do not assume that there's some kind of a special distinction between, phenomenally conscious states and just functionally conscious states, we have actually a wider range of moral obligations towards other creatures, because for us, all it takes is a certain set of functional properties for an organism to have in order for it to be able to suffer. And if that's the case, then perhaps a lot more organisms are capable of suffering than on more realist, more kind of exceptionalist pictures of conscious experience.
Yeah, thank you very much. And about the last point that you raised, I think that some people used to think that error theorists in ethics or relativists are also immoral persons, but I don't think that many people are thinking like that these days. I think that the same may also as well apply to the relation between illusionism and ethics. But Mark and Wanja, in any order that you prefer, about last correspondence that Wanja raised.
Yeah, maybe I can clarify the question. So, Mark, if I understood you correctly, you said something like, look, every physical system seeks to continue to exist, and a computer hardware is also a thermodynamic system, and so it has some existential needs, and I, of course, agree with this, but I don't see how anything that's going on in a computer simulation can have consequences, existential consequences for the physical system that is implementing the computer simulation. Maybe that's not what you wanted to say, but just had this question.
Okay, thank you. Well, just I'll address very briefly that point and then answer the question as it was in the chat line. And then I'm sure I'm not the only one. I've got a meeting in 8 minutes, so I'm going to have to go very shortly. It's not just any old system. We're speaking about complex dynamical self-organizing systems which have the specific dynamics that the specific architecture that I was referring to. In other words, it's not a matter of having a monotonous, when X happens, I do Y. When X happens, I do Y. It's not that kind of system. It's a system that is able to adapt its actions to changing circumstances in unpredicted environments in order to meet its existential needs. So it's not every self-organizing system that has the dynamics I'm talking about, which are the subset of self-organizing systems which feel like something to be those systems. Now, to come to the question in the chat line, I'll build on what Chris said about, you illusionists know better than anyone that, we're living in a virtual reality all the time. In other words, we're living in a picture that we are constructing of the reality that we have to survive in. So the system is interacting only with its model of the world, and testing that model. And here's where I come to the crucial point: testing that model via allostasis, via its actions in the outside world, ultimately testing its model in terms of its viability as a model of how do I continue to exist. And so the reality of the system, speaking now of this question of consciousness and self-consciousness that Chris was also mentioning, the ultimate test of the model is, do I continue to exist or do I not? And I'm saying that's what feeling is for. Feeling tells you before it's too late how well you're doing in terms of that imperative, and it makes no difference. The system cannot but be enveloped, sequestered within its bubble, within its blanket, which creates a virtual reality. I don't see any distinction between the, as Karl put it, the physical and mathematical dynamics that are required for this system to continue to exist, whether it's ultimately via some avatar or not. It is that system which has those existential needs. The dynamics are the same regardless of how it's embodied. I'm sorry if I'm not doing justice to it all. I'm so mindful of the fact that I'm going to be gone in a few minutes, and over to you.
All right. It took longer than I expected, which means that my predictions are not accurate, which will have existential consequences for me. But I think that the fact that free energy principle has evolved into both realist and illusionist interpretations bears testimony to the theoretical richness of this framework. If we had time, I would ask Karl to add a few sentences about this, but I don't think that we have enough time. Do we? No. So I think that I have to thank you very much for participating and for very fantastic and rich discussions. And I'm going to stop the recording right now. The papers that have been mentioned, I put them in a detailed note to this video for the benefit of our readers. So I'm going to stop recording, and thank you very much.